friends and neighbors, and welcome to the Ghost Punk Horror Podcast. I'm Matt Burke, your host for All the Ghosts. Salem's Lot was my first Stephen King novel, and it was a very formative piece of writing for me, both as a writer, as somebody who enjoys horror, and as an adult as well. I remember when I first came across it, I just inherited my great-grandmother's 94 Cutlass Supreme, complete with blue vinyl interior. It was my first car. The thing about the car is that it only had a tape deck and an AM/FM radio. I found Salem's Lot in a remainder store, all on cassette. Never before had listened to Stephen King or read Stephen King. I just knew that he was scary. He was a prominent horror writer. I know that I had seen The Shawshank Redemption, but that was about the limit of my experience with Stephen King at the time. 2009 was about the height of the Stephenie Meyer Twilight craze, where vampires had become all the rage. I remember getting a secondhand copy of Twilight and making it about 11 chapters in before throwing it across the room, saying, God, I can write better than this shit. And it wasn't just that the writing was bad, it was, but that the vampires weren't scary. Edward Cullen was definitely not a scary dude. I'd read Dracula in my freshman year of high school. I remember having the ever-loving shit terrified out of me by reading it. And I wanted a vampire story that matched that. I wanted to be scared by vampires, not enthralled by them. Lo and behold, Stephen King comes with the exact thing that I'm looking for. In his introduction to the book, he talks about wanting to have vampires that snarl and rip and tear, much like the vampires of the old EC horror comics that he grew up with. And the more I got absorbed into it, the more I felt connected to the town of Salem's Lot. I felt connected to the characters in a way that I hadn't really been connected to any other piece of fiction before. And considering at the time of recording that it's October and Halloween is on the way and spooky season is officially here, I feel it would be good to go back and look at Salem's Lot in a critical way as an adult. Salem's Lot takes place in the small Maine town of Jerusalem's Lot, centering on the young writer Ben Mears. Ben has come back to his old hometown after the death of his wife Miranda, and hopes to write it out of his system with a new book, inspired by his childhood. Long ago, Ben was dared to go into the Marston house, an old mansion supposedly haunted by the owner who went crazy and killed his wife, then himself. He stole a small glass paperweight like a snow globe, only to come across what he thinks was the bloated, rotting corpse of Hubert Marston himself, hanging from a noose in the attic. Ben originally intended to rent the Marston house, only to discover it was purchased by two men, Kurt Barlow and Richard Throckett Straker, who came to the town under the pretense of opening an antique store for summer and fall tourists. Unbeknownst to everyone in the town, Barlow is a vampire, with Straker acting as his familiar. As things start going wrong, with people getting sick and mysteriously dying or going missing, Ben and his new friends, his girlfriend Susan Norton, an elderly English teacher Matt Burke, gee, that name sounds familiar, Dr. Jimmy Cody, M.D., Father Callahan of the local Catholic Church, and Mark Petrie, a young boy who is a new transplant to the town, much like Ben himself, all join as a crew of mostly fearless vampire hunters. But it's all for naught. Barlow and Straker planned too well to be stopped by the likes of them. The fearless vampire hunters play into Barlow's game, first by taking too long to debate whether the possibility of vampires in the lot is too ridiculous to be taken seriously, and second by splitting up their forces to take practical or productive routes to figure out the truth. All the while, Barlow has been a busy little bat, seducing the townsfolk individually to embrace the unlife of a vampire in the most infernal pyramid scheme possible as new sired vamps begin converting their friends and neighbors. One by one, the hunters fall or fail, leaving Ben and Mark alone to face Barlow. I think what struck me the most at 17, reading the book for the first time, was the living nature of the town. Cities like Revachol in the game Disco Elysium, Mark Frost and David Lynch's Twin Peaks, or China Miéville's New Crobuzon from his fantasy novel Perdido Street Station feel like vibrant, thriving locations with people who actually live in it. The town of Jerusalem's Lot, Maine, known to its citizens as Salem's Lot, or just the Lot, feels like a character in and of itself. King directly characterizes and personifies it throughout the novel as being like an old friend, one who knows the audience personally, knows their fears and their insecurities as much as it knows the masks they wear. I grew up in a town very much like Salem's Lot. I could look at any character in the story and think of at least 3 people that character reminded me of. My mother and I once talked about my hometown. She said that the town was like a middle middle-aged man who peaked in high school and never got over it. My assessment was more that the town was like a vampire, slowly sucking the life out of everyone over time. When we see Salem's Lot in the novel, it's a dying town, one that doesn't really know its terminal condition. It holds on to its life through the dysfunction of its characters, but the town is unwilling to acknowledge and embrace change. Most of the townspeople hold on to what's comfortable and familiar. They wake up, they go to the same jobs many of their own parents had. They hide their hurts, their depraved fantasies, and their traumas under a mask of small-town cordiality. It's a close-knit town, and one that's weary of outsiders. Sheriff Parkins Gillespie tells Ben at one point, when he's suspected of being involved with some of the disappearances in the town, and that he doesn't mean any hostility by it, that he's the new man in town until he's lived here at least 20 years. The town doesn't change much. Ben muses that it's barely even changed at all since he was a boy living there with his aunt. It's because of this that Barlow is able to take over the town so easily. The townspeople of Salem's Lot are resistant to change. They have dreams and desires, but those are caught up in a cyclical mentality that comes back to both how wonderful the old days were and how bad things are now that they never materialized into the way they expected them to. They can't grow and be stuck in the past at the same time. They don't want to confront their old pains and traumas, but to sweep them under the rug. Ben nearly runs into a similar thought trap as he comes to the lot in order to run away from processing the death of his wife. The novel he tries to write confronts the fears of his childhood at the Marston house without looking at the fears of his adulthood as a man coming back to deal with the specters of his past. Father Callahan, like Father Karras in The Exorcist, tries to confront the questions of his faith, and rather than processing what the impact of the Catholic Church has in the era of civil rights and social change in a post-Vietnam, post-Nixon era, he retreats into an alcohol-fueled cynicism, one that suggests that the Catholic Church is fucked and has always been fucked, and they'll never stop being fucked. Susan Norton's mother is afraid of her daughter growing up and leaving town to achieve her own passions. Susan dating Ben, who is an outsider, exacerbates those fears of her not living up to the cozy life informed by her mother's experience, so her mother pushes back against her daughter, trying to clip her wings before she has an opportunity to fly out of the nest. The philosophical idea of hauntology was coined by Jacques Derrida, who considered that Karl Marx and communism are specters hanging over Europe, ones of futures that never came to pass. Hauntology itself is a play on words of the philosophical idea of ontology, which is the study of being and categorization of metaphysical concepts in order to determine being. The late Mark Fisher, in his book Ghost in My Life, explains hauntology like this, quote, "Everything that exists is possible only on the basis of a whole series of absences, which precede and surround it, allowing it to possess such consistency and intelligibility that it does. But hauntology explicitly brings into play the question of time in a way that had not been the case with the trace or différence. Derrida's aim, Haglund argues, is to formulate a general hauntology in contrast to the traditional ontology that thinks being in terms of self-identical presence. What is important about the figure of the spectre, then, is that it cannot be fully present. It has no being in itself, but marks a relation to what is no longer or not yet. Is hauntology, then, some attempt to revive the supernatural, or is it just a figure of speech? The way out of this unhelpful position is to think of hauntology as the agency of the virtual, with the spectre understood not as anything supernatural, but as that which acts without physically existing." Unquote. Hubert Marston and the Marston House exist as specters over the town, ones in which Hubert Marston's madness, his darker tendencies and abuse of his wife, as well as his past as a member of the Boston mob, were ignored as warning signs by the people in the town, and actively chose to ignore it or live alongside the remains of it instead of confronting it. The old people of the lot hoped that by ignoring the problem and keeping the Marston house where it stood, they could keep up the facade that nothing was wrong with the town itself, that their way of life wasn't actively corrupting and decaying, and it can stay the same as long as they hold on to their ways of life. Salem's Lot in the present of 1975 continues to both ignore and mythologize Marston for about half a century. acknowledging the house only when they have to, and building up Marston's legacy of evil as him being a sort of malicious boogeyman. Marston helped pave the way for Barlow to come to the lot, informing him in the years of long ago about the town, its people, and acting as a sort of familiar to the vampire long before Straker came into the picture. Barlow understands the town, he has had time to study it, and understands the town's current residents better than they even know themselves. Where Barlow is so successfully insidious is how familiar he is, not just with the town as a concept, but with its people. He knows how resistant they are to change, their fears of leaving or their lives as they know them being uprooted. He knows their secret desires. He knows that the things that go wrong in their lives or how unsuccessful they feel is met with a, well, that's just how life is, ain't it? He's an expert marketing specialist and salesman for vampirism, isolating the people individually, addressing their pain points, and selling them on how good life could be if they just took what they wanted and became vampires. Corey Bryant is beaten up by Reggie Sawyer for sleeping with his wife and threatened to leave town at the business end of a shotgun. Barlow gets to him by suggesting that he deserves to stay in the town. It belongs to him and he belongs to it, and that people like Reggie Sawyer have grown fat off of their opportunities where people like Corey Bryant didn't have them. Same too with Dud Rogers, the town's hunchbacked garbage dump custodian. Dud Rogers is a bit of a pariah in town. He's made fun of by girls he's sexually attracted to for his physical appearance, and he's met with scorn and distaste from the more respectable element of the town. Barlow tells him that he shouldn't have to put up with being made fun of, that he is beautiful in his own right, and that he, like Corey Bryant, can taste just how sweet life can be if they're willing to take it into their own hands. In this way, Barlow isn't just a vampire in the traditional sense, but he is also a hauntological vampire as well. Though hauntology uses the motif of hauntings and ghosts, primarily that of King Hamlet's ghost in William Shakespeare's Hamlet, I do think that there is a place to see vampirism in the context of hauntology. I'm a little more than hesitant to make this next comparison, but I can't think of a better example of vampirism as a concept in hauntology than this. If Derrida sees Marx as a specter over Europe, then the ones of Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee hang over the southern states of America. The Confederate States of America barely lasted 5 years, but the remains of the great lost cause are still felt and seen today in southern social conservatism. Since the war, organizations like Daughters of the Confederacy have worked to paint the rebellion and secession of the southern states into a positive light. The argument put forward is that the Civil War wasn't actually about slavery, but states' rights. Stripping the context from those states' rights being about slavery and the treatment of people as chattel property being written as guiding principles in Articles 1 and 4 of the Confederate Constitution. That the rebel flag known as the Stars and Bars and monuments venerating Confederate generals are ways of honoring tradition and the fallen instead of being used as tools of intimidation against people of color. Robert E. Lee himself stated that Confederate monuments and symbols would, quote, serve to keep the wounds of war open, unquote. It is from this perspective, the one of the defeated, that many Confederate apologists and revisionists take in order to cope with being seen as villains, racists, and generally being on the wrong side of history. Ignorant, willing or otherwise, to what those symbols and contrarian viewpoints mean to those oppressed under the regime they hold up and mythologize. In doing so, they sit firmly in their resentments of defeat and being considered the bad guy, and foster new resentments that feed from and taint the possibility of growth and critical self-reflection of the principles and views of the past. In a report on the state of Florida's changes to public school curriculum regarding Reconstruction after the Civil War, the Zen Education Project notes, quote, teaching Reconstruction effectively requires centering black people's struggles to redefine freedom and equality and gain control of their own land and labor during and after the Civil War. Any discussion of Reconstruction must also grapple with the role of white supremacist terrorism in the defeat of Reconstruction and the negative and positive legacies of the era that persist to this day. In June 2021, the State Board of Education voted to approve a rule to ban schools from teaching materials from the 1619 Project, as well as the theory that racism is not merely a product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white person. In January 2022, Republican legislators introduced HB 7 and SB 148, two bills designed to restrict discussions and lessons about racism and sexism. With particularly troubling language, the Senate bill states, American history shall be viewed as factual, not as constructed, shall be viewed as knowledgeable, teachable, and testable, and shall be defined as the creation of a new nation based largely on the universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. The House bill passed with that session and became law. In April 2022, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the Stop Wrongs Against Our Kids and Employees Act, or Stop Woke Act, to bar instruction and discussion of systematic racism and sexism. This law also allows parents private right of action to sue if they believe their children are being taught critical race theory. Several respondents to our survey expressed concern about the possible chilling effects on classroom education that such measures have around the country, particularly on the discussions of history and legacies of Reconstruction." Unquote. If we take the premise of hauntology concerning ghosts of the future which did not materialize that haunt the present, the hauntological vampire in this case would be a resentment of this future not coming to pass that feeds parasitically off anxiety, stress, and nervous tension at observing this disconnect, and continues to sire new resentments that could taint the future beyond our current circumstances. Kurt Barlow, like the Confederacy, utilizes a present resentment to a perceived loss of one's way of life, feeding upon and encouraging new resentments, rather than being a force to confront issues of the past and remain stagnant in one's present. Taken to its most extreme conclusion, these resentments will continue to multiply and poison discourse moving forward, encouraging regressive growth through stagnancy. There is no need to question and confront into one's current issues and circumstances if their ways of life can be immortalized as vampires. Life will continue seemingly unchanged from what it is today, to the detriment of possibilities of what could be. I remember the day that I finished Salem's Lot. It was a rainy Tuesday in the fall of 2009. I was driving home from school, and when I got to the house, I went straight to my room and listened to the last handful of tapes in the dark over the course of a few hours. I don't remember being scared in this final stretch, just worn down and defeated. Susan Norton had been turned into a vampire and slain. Matt Burke, Jimmy Cody, and Mark Petrie's parents all dead, and my favorite character, Father Callahan, being forced to drink Barlow's blood. Tainted by the vampire curse, but not turned into a vampire, he runs away from the town into self-imposed exile to drink himself to death. Barlow might have been slain, a stake driven through his heart and crumbling into dust in the basement of the boarding house where Benjamin Mears called home for the past few months. But Barlow had also won for all intents and purposes. The town was lost to the vampires, and all Ben and Mark can do is run away. When the last tape ended, I laid in bed until dinner was ready, feeling emotionally drained in a way that I wouldn't feel again until this summer of 2023 when I finished listening to Poppy Z. Bright's Exquisite Corpse. This shouldn't have caught me by surprise. The story's prologue has Ben and Mark hiding in Mexico, running from the guilt and shame of not being able to save their loved ones. They return to the lot in the epilogue, knowing they can't leave the job half done. Not only do the vampires pose a problem for the rest of the region, but to ignore the grisly work they left behind means they will be just as cursed as Callahan, unable to move on with their lives. Usually I skip the prologue when I go back and listen to the audiobook. Whenever I return to Salem's Lot, it's usually for pleasure, and even though the prologue is relatively short, I want to get back to the meat of the story, to sink my teeth into it, as it were. Coming back to Salem's Lot for me is strange every time, because I do so with a weird optimism. This time will be different. Ben won't have to stake Susan because they'll stop Barlow and Straker before they even have a chance. The vampire hunters will win. Jimmy and Matt won't die. Callahan won't suffer and lose his faith either. Life in the lot might remain stubbornly, stagnantly the same, but the town will survive this time. I love all the characters in Salem's Lot. I want them to have happy endings, even though I know it's all going to go wrong. I like to think that, in hoping for a happier ending, I can confront my own stagnancy when it raises its head, and that will help me burn down my own haunted houses before they can become breeding grounds for depression and anxiety and resentment. In the end, Ben returns to his old room in the boarding house, still the same as he left it. He sets fire to his old manuscript and shatters the glass paperweight he took from the Marston house as a child. He and Mark then go to the blasted manse itself to set fire to it and dislodge any vamps still living there, like burning a wasp's nest with the wasps still inside. They have a lot of long days and unpleasant nights ahead of them, but in doing so they find redemption for the guilt and shame they feel in failing and fleeing the town. None of the townspeople could confront their regrets and learn to grow from them, embracing the unlife of becoming a vampire to avoid change and personal growth. The end may be a pessimistic one, but there's still a sliver of hope that Mark and Ben may be able to move on with their lives long after the curse of the vampire has left Salem's Lot for good. Thank you for coming along with me on this deep dive of Salem's Lot. I've taken a long hiatus from reading Stephen King novels, and it feels good to come back to the same novel I reached for so many years ago, especially since it always puts me in the mood for fall. This has been Ghost Punk. I've been Matt Burke. You've been wonderful. And remember, if you come across a vampire, don't run away. Bite that bloodsucker before they bite you. You worked hard to get where you are today, and you're not going to let some pasty freak from a toxic aristocracy drag you down, damn it. Until next time, friends and neighbors, bye.